The early morning sun cast long shadows across the private terminal at Los Angeles International Airport. Sarah Chen Williams adjusted her designer blazer and pulled her sleek carry-on bag behind her heels clicking confidently on the polished floor. At 42, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had fought hard for her success in the aviation industry. Today was supposed to be routine, a quick flight to New York for a board meeting of Elite Aviation Services, where she had recently been appointed CEO. Sarah had made this trip countless times before, but this morning would prove different. As she approached the private terminal's security checkpoint, she noticed the guard's expression change. James Morrison, a man in his mid-50s who had worked airport security for over 2 decades, straightened up in his chair and frowned. His eyes darted between Sarah and her expensive luggage, making quick judgments that would soon prove embarrassingly wrong. "Excuse me, miss," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the hint of suspicion. "This is a private terminal. The main passenger entrance is in Terminal 4. He didn't bother to rise from his seat, simply pointing toward the exit with his pen. Sarah took a deep breath, having experienced similar situations throughout her career. "I'm aware this is the private terminal," she replied calmly, reaching for her identification and flight documentation. "I'm scheduled on the 8:30 a.m. charter to New York." Morrison's face hardened. "Ma'am, these are private jets, unless you're part of the flight crew." He let the sentence hang in the air, his implication clear. Sarah maintained her composure, though her heart raced with familiar frustration. "I understand that. Here are my credentials and flight details." She held out the documents, but Morrison made no move to examine them. "Listen, I've worked here for 20 years. I know who usually comes through these doors." Morrison's tone grew more dismissive. "I'm trying to save you the embarrassment. This isn't your terminal." Other travelers began to notice the exchange. A few white executives walked past, giving Sarah curious glances as Morrison waved them through without question. One elderly businessman even smirked, adding to the humiliation of the moment. "Sir," Sarah spoke firmly, "I am the CEO of Elite Aviation Services. This is my company's jet, and I have every right to be here. I suggest you check my documentation before making any more assumptions." Morrison laughed, a short, harsh sound that echoed through the terminal. "Right. And I'm the President of the United States." He finally stood up, his 6-foot frame attempting to intimidate. "Now, I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security." "I am security," a new voice interrupted. Lisa Rodriguez, the terminal's head of security, rushed forward with a look of horror on her face. "Oh my God, Ms. Chen Williams, I am so sorry." She turned to Morrison, her expression darkening. "James, this is Sarah Chen Williams, the new CEO of Elite Aviation. Our photo was in last month's company memo." The color drained from Morrison's face as he finally looked, really looked, at the documentation Sarah still held out. There, clear as day, was her photo ID, executive credentials, and flight manifest showing her as the primary passenger. Other staff members had gathered now, including the pilot who would be flying Sarah to New York. The terminal fell silent except for the distant sound of jet engines. Morrison's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Ms. Chen Williams," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't." Sarah held up her hand, stopping his stammered apology. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of every similar experience she'd faced in her career. "Mr. Morrison, I believe we need to have a conversation about this incident, but first, I have a board meeting to attend in New York." As Lisa personally escorted Sarah through security, Morrison sank back into his chair, the reality of his actions beginning to sink in. He had just discriminated against the CEO of one of the largest private aviation companies in the country, but more importantly, he had judged someone based solely on their appearance, and he knew his world was about to change. Unknown to both Sarah and Morrison at that moment, this confrontation would spark a transformation that would ripple through the entire aviation industry. Word spread quickly through Los Angeles International Airport's private terminal about the morning's incident. James Morrison sat in the break room during his mandatory break, his coffee growing cold as he stared at his phone. The company memo with Sarah Chen Williams' appointment announcement was open on the screen, and her professional headshot seemed to stare back at him accusingly. Lisa Rodriguez, the head of security, entered the break room with a stern expression. James, we need to talk about what happened this morning. She sat across from him, placing a folder on the table. Do you realize how serious this is? Morrison rubbed his face with his hands. I made a mistake, Lisa. I'll apologize when she returns. His voice lacked its usual confidence. A mistake? Lisa opened the folder. Let me tell you exactly who you just discriminated against. Sarah Chen Williams isn't just a late aviation CEO. She started as a flight attendant 20 years ago, worked her way through night school to get her MBA, and eventually became the youngest vice president in the company's history. Morrison's stomach sank further as Lisa continued. She's also on the board of 3 major aviation companies and has won numerous industry awards for her work in modernizing private aviation services. Lisa pushed a magazine across the table. Sarah was on the cover of Aviation Business Monthly. The break room door opened again. This time, Robert Chen, Sarah's father and the founder of Elite Aviation Services, walked in. Morrison felt the blood drain from his face as he recognized the company's legendary former CEO. Mr. Morrison, Robert said quietly, pulling up a chair. I built this company from nothing. When my daughter told me she wanted to work in aviation, starting as a flight attendant, I worried about people exactly like you. Morrison tried to speak, but Robert held up his hand. Let me finish. Sarah refused my help. She said she needed to prove herself on her own merits. For 20 years, she's faced people who took one look at her and decided they knew who she was and what she was capable of. Security footage from the morning's incident played on the break room's small TV. Morrison watched himself dismissing Sarah without even checking her credentials, saw his condescending smile, and witnessed his attempt to intimidate her. Seeing his actions from this perspective made him feel sick. The board of directors is calling for your immediate termination, Lisa explained, opening another document. They're also considering legal action for discrimination. Morrison's world spun. 20 years of work, his pension, his reputation, all potentially gone because of 5 minutes of prejudiced behavior. I don't know what to say, he managed. Then listen, Robert replied. Sarah is landing in New York right now. Do you know what she did during her flight? Instead of calling for your firing, she spent 3 hours drafting a proposal for a new diversity and inclusion training program. She believes this incident could become a teaching moment. Lisa pulled out another document. She's offering you a choice, James. Option 1, termination, probable legal action, and a very difficult time finding another job in airport security. Option 2, you become part of the solution. Part of the solution? Morrison asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah wants you to help develop and implement the new training program. She thinks your experience, this transformation you're going through right now, could help others recognize and address their own biases. Morrison stared at the documents in front of him, then at the security footage, still playing on the TV. He saw himself as others had seen him this morning, not as the professional he thought he was, but as someone whose prejudices had clouded his judgment and nearly destroyed his career. When does she return from New York? He asked finally. Tomorrow afternoon, Lisa answered. She's requested a meeting with you. Robert stood up, straightening his suit. My daughter believes people can change, Mr. Morrison. She's seen it happen throughout her career. The question is, are you willing to be honest with yourself about why you did what you did this morning? As Robert and Lisa left the break room, Morrison remained seated, the weight of his choices, both past and future, heavy on his shoulders. Tomorrow's meeting would either end his career or begin a journey of transformation he never expected to take. The next afternoon, James Morrison stood nervously outside the conference room at LAX's private terminal. He had traded his security uniform for a simple black suit, the one he usually saved for church. His hands felt clammy as he adjusted his tie for the 5th time. Sarah Chen Williams' flight from New York had landed 30 minutes ago. Through the conference room's glass walls, Morrison could see her speaking with Lisa Rodriguez and several board members. She looked exactly as professional as she had yesterday, but today he saw her differently, not as an intruder to be stopped, but as the accomplished executive she truly was. Mr. Morrison, Sarah's assistant called from the doorway. We're ready for you. Walking into the conference room felt like entering the courtroom. 8 pairs of eyes turned to watch him, including Robert Chen's. Sarah sat at the head of the table, a stack of papers in front of her. She gestured to an empty chair. "Please, Mr. Morrison, have a seat." Her voice was calm and professional, showing no sign of yesterday's confrontation. "I appreciate you coming today." Morrison sat down, trying to keep his hands from shaking. "Ms. Chen Williams, before we start, I need to apologize. My behavior yesterday was a perfect example of why we're here today," Sarah finished for him. She opened a folder and passed copies to everyone at the table. "What happened yesterday wasn't just about you and me, Mr. Morrison. It's about a larger problem in our industry." She pressed a button, and the room's screen displayed statistics about diversity in aviation. In the past year alone, we've had 27 reported incidents of discrimination at private aviation terminals across the country. Those are just the reported cases. Morrison felt the weight of his actions even more heavily. He wasn't alone in his prejudices, but that made it worse, not better. "However," Sarah continued, "I see an opportunity here. Mr. Morrison, you've worked in aviation security for 20 years. You know this industry. You've seen it from ground level. And now, you've experienced something most people in your position never do: the immediate consequences of unchecked bias." She turned to face him directly. "Tell me honestly, before yesterday, had you ever really thought about how your assumptions affected others?" Morrison swallowed hard. "No, ma'am. I thought I was just doing my job, being careful. But watching that security footage," he paused, gathering his thoughts. "I saw myself through other people's eyes for the first time. I didn't like what I saw." Sarah nodded, then surprised everyone by smiling. "That self-awareness is exactly why I think you could be valuable to our new initiative." She passed him a specific document from her stack. "This is my proposal for a comprehensive training program, not just sensitivity training. We've all seen how ineffective that can be. This is about real change, real understanding." The room fell silent as Morrison read through the proposal. The program would take 6 months. He would work directly with Sarah and a team of diversity experts. Together, they would develop training modules based on real experiences, including his own story. "You want me to?" He looked up, confused. "You want me to tell other security officers about how I discriminated against you?" "I want you to tell them about how you changed," Sarah corrected. "Your story, this moment right here, could be more powerful than 100 lectures about bias, but only if you're genuinely ready to do the work." Robert Chen spoke up from his corner. "It's your choice, Mr. Morrison, but know that if you accept, you'll have to face some uncomfortable truths about yourself. You'll have to be honest, vulnerable, and open to change." Morrison looked around the room, at the faces waiting for his answer. He thought about his 20 years at the airport, about all the times he might have made assumptions like he did yesterday. He thought about his own daughter, who faced discrimination in her teaching job, and how he had never quite understood her stories until now. "When do we start?" he asked finally. Sarah's smile widened. "Right now, Mr. Morrison, right now." As the meeting continued, outside the conference room windows, planes took off into the clear Los Angeles sky, carrying people to destinations all over the world. Inside, a different kind of journey was just beginning. 1 week after the conference room meeting, James Morrison sat uncomfortably in a small classroom at Elite Aviation's training center. Around him, photos of aviation pioneers lined the walls, including several faces he had never noticed before. Bessie Coleman, the first African-American woman pilot; Mae Jemison, the first African-American woman astronaut; and now, Sarah Chen Williams' photo among them. Today marked the first session of the diversity training program. Morrison had arrived early, his notebook ready, unsure what to expect. He watched as other security officers filed in, some giving him curious looks. His story had spread through the airport like wildfire. Sarah walked in precisely at 9 a.m., followed by Dr. Maya Thompson, a diversity education expert with 20 years of experience. The room fell silent as Sarah took her position at the front. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah began, her voice firm but friendly. "We're not here to shame anyone. We're here to learn, to grow, and to make our industry better." She gestured to Morrison. "Mr. Morrison has bravely agreed to share his experience with us. But first, I'm going to share some of mine." For the next hour, Sarah described incidents throughout her career that made Morrison's stomach churn. The flight passenger who demanded a different flight attendant. The investors who spoke only to her mail assistant during meetings. The countless times she was mistaken for support staff rather than an executive. The worst part wasn't the big incidents, Sarah explained, her voice steady. It was the small ones. The everyday assumptions. The constant need to prove myself, over and over. Dr. Thompson stepped forward. This is where implicit bias lives, she explained. In the quick judgments we make without even realizing it. Mr. Morrison, would you like to share your perspective? Morrison's throat felt dry as he stood up. Facing his colleagues, he saw his own past attitudes reflected in some of their faces, the skepticism, the defensive postures. He took a deep breath. A week ago, I thought I was one of the good ones, he began. I have a black daughter-in-law. I have friends from different backgrounds. I thought that meant I couldn't be prejudiced. He paused, looking at Sarah. Then I watched myself on that security footage. I watched myself dismiss Ms. Chen Williams without even checking her credentials. I watched myself try to intimidate her. The room was completely silent now. Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger. I've spent 20 years making split-second judgments about people. I told myself I was being careful, being professional. But last week, I had to face the truth. I wasn't judging people by their behavior. I was judging them by how they looked. Dr. Thompson nodded encouragingly. What made this time different, Mr. Morrison? Watching the video, he answered honestly, seeing my own face, my own actions, and then learning who Ms. Chen Williams really was, not just her position, but her journey. It made me realize how many other times I might have been wrong, how many people I might have hurt without ever knowing it. Sarah stepped forward again. This is why we're starting this program. Not because one incident happened, but because thousands of similar incidents happen every day. And most of the time, unlike Mr. Morrison, people don't get the chance to see the impact of their actions. The training continued through the morning. They analyzed case studies, discussed real situations, and practiced scenarios. Morrison watched his colleagues slowly move from defensive to thoughtful, just as he had. During the lunch break, a young security officer approached Morrison. I've done it too, she admitted quietly. Made those same kinds of judgments. I just never had to face them like you did. Morrison nodded, understanding completely. The hardest part, he told her, is admitting it to yourself, but it's also the most important part. As the afternoon session began, Sarah caught Morrison's eye and gave him an encouraging nod. He realized that this wasn't just about making amends for one mistake. It was about creating real change, starting with the person in the mirror. The walls of the training room seemed to echo with unspoken stories, thousands of moments like his confrontation with Sarah, playing out in airports and offices and streets across the country. But here, in this room, something was different. Here, those stories were finally being heard. 1 month into the training program, the small classroom had transformed into a hub of activity. Charts and feedback boards covered the walls, filled with honest conversations and real experiences. James Morrison stood at the front, no longer the nervous participant, but now a confident facilitator. Remember last month when I couldn't even admit my own biases? He asked the newest group of security personnel. Today, we're going to talk about how those biases affect our daily decisions and what we can do about it. Sarah Chen Williams watched from the back of the room, impressed by Morrison's transformation. She hadn't expected him to become such a powerful advocate for change. As he shared his story, she noticed how the other officers leaned forward, engaged by his honesty. After the session, Sarah called Morrison to her office. The view of the runways stretched out behind her desk, planes taking off into the California sky. Mr. Morrison, we've been invited to speak at the National Aviation Security Conference next month, she announced. Morrison's eyes widened. Me? Speak at a national conference? Yes, you, Sarah smiled. Our program is getting attention. Other airports want to know how we're making real changes, not just running through the usual diversity training checkboxes. She handed him a folder containing letters from other security officers who had gone through their program. The testimonials were powerful. Officers wrote about confronting their own biases, about changing their approach to passenger interactions, about creating a more welcoming environment. But that's not all, Sarah continued. Elite Aviation is expanding the initiative. We're creating a full department focused on diversity and inclusion in aviation security, and we want you to help lead it. Morrison sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. Ms. Chen Williams, I'm just a security guard who made a terrible mistake. No, Sarah corrected him. You're someone who faced that mistake honestly and turned it into an opportunity for change. That's exactly what we need. The door opened, and Lisa Rodriguez entered with more statistics. Our complaint numbers are down 60% since the program started, she reported. And our passenger satisfaction scores are up. People notice when they're treated with respect. Morrison looked at the numbers, thinking about how far they'd come. He remembered his first day of training, how defensive everyone had been. Now, officers were voluntarily signing up for additional sessions, sharing their own stories, asking tough questions. There's something else, Sarah added. Remember that young officer, Jenny, who spoke to you after your first session? She's been leading her own discussion groups with the night shift staff. They've come up with some excellent suggestions for improving our procedures. Morrison nodded proudly. He'd been mentoring Jenny, watching her grow from someone afraid to acknowledge biases to a strong advocate for change. The night shift has different challenges, he explained. Different passenger demographics, different security concerns. Jenny helped us understand that one-size-fits-all training isn't enough. Sarah stood and walked to the window, watching a private jet taxi toward the terminal. When you stopped me that morning, Mr. Morrison, I had two choices. I could demand your firing and move on, or I could try to create real change. I chose change because I've seen how powerful transformation can be. She turned back to face him. But I never expected you to become such a vital part of that transformation. You've taken this program far beyond what I imagined. Morrison thought about his own journey, from that humiliating morning to today. He thought about all the passengers he'd misjudged over the years, all the assumptions he'd made. But mostly, he thought about the future. When's the conference? He asked. Next month in Dallas, Lisa answered. Think you're ready? Morrison stood up, straightening his shoulders. A month ago, I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. Now I'm helping others see themselves clearly, maybe for the first time. Yeah, I'm ready. As if to emphasize his words, the private jet outside touched down smoothly on the runway. Another arrival, another chance to do things right. In the reflection of Sarah's office window, Morrison saw himself, not just as he was, but as he was becoming. The initiative wasn't just changing procedures. It was changing people, one honest conversation at a time. The Dallas Convention Center hummed with activity as hundreds of aviation security professionals gathered for the National Aviation Security Conference. James Morrison stood backstage, adjusting his new tie, a gift from his daughter-in-law. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning at LAX, and now he was about to address the largest audience of his career. Sarah Chen Williams approached him, tablet in hand. Ready? She asked, smiling at his obvious nervousness. What if they don't believe me? Morrison whispered. What if they think this whole program is just for show? Then show them it's not, Sarah replied simply. Show them what real change looks like. The conference hall was packed. Security directors from airports across the country sat ready with their notebooks. Morrison recognized several famous faces from the aviation industry. His palms began to sweat. The host introduced them. Please welcome Sarah Chen Williams, CEO of Elite Aviation Services, and James Morrison, Director of Diversity Initiatives in Aviation Security. Morrison still wasn't used to his new title. As he walked onto the stage with Sarah, he remembered his security guard uniform, how differently it had felt. The spotlight was bright, but he could see hundreds of faces looking up at him. Sarah spoke first, explaining the program's origins. Then she turned to Morrison. I'll let James tell you his story in his own words. Morrison stepped to the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. 6 months ago, I was the problem that this industry needed to solve. I was the security guard who saw a black woman approaching a private jet terminal and immediately decided she didn't belong there. The room fell silent. Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger. That woman was my boss. Though I didn't know it then, I tried to turn her away without even checking her ID. I tried to humiliate her. Instead, I humiliated myself and nearly lost everything I'd worked for. He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from their program. But Ms. Chen Williams didn't fire me. Instead, she showed me something I'd never seen before, my own prejudice in action, and then she'd offered me a chance to help others see the same thing. For the next 30 minutes, Morrison and Sarah presented their program's results. They showed videos of security officers sharing their experiences, statistics showing improved passenger satisfaction, and testimonials from staff members whose perspectives had changed. The key, Morrison explained, is that we don't just talk about bias, we show it, we face it, we admit it, and then we learn how to do better. During the question and answer session, a security director from Chicago raised his hand. This all sounds great, but let's be real. Can a few training sessions really change people's deep-seated prejudices? Morrison looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Sir, let me tell you about Jenny, he began. He shared how the young officer had transformed from someone afraid to speak up to a leader who was now training others. Change is possible when people want to change. Our job is to help them want it. After the presentation, security directors crowded around them, asking for program details. Morrison found himself surrounded by people who, 6 months ago, would have been his superiors. Now they were peers, eager to learn from his experience. Later that evening, at the conference dinner, Sarah clinked her glass for attention. I'd like to propose a toast, she announced. To James Morrison, who proved that the biggest changes start with the hardest truths. Morrison felt tears in his eyes as the room applauded. He thought about his journey, from security guard to program director, from part of the problem to part of the solution. Back at his table, he checked his phone and found a message from Jenny. Boss, you'll never believe what happened today. Had a situation just like yours, officer trying to turn away an executive who didn't look right. But this time, we handled it differently. Your training worked. Morrison showed the message to Sarah, who smiled. That's how change happens, she said. One person, one moment, one decision at a time. Outside the convention center, planes flew overhead, carrying thousands of passengers who would never know how a single confrontation 6 months ago was helping to change the way they would be treated at airports across the country. 1 year after the incident at LAX, Sarah Chen Williams stood in front of a massive screen at the Aviation Industry Leadership Summit in New York. Behind her, a map showed glowing dots representing every airport that had adopted their diversity program. There were now 57 dots spread across the country. When we started this journey, Sarah addressed the packed auditorium. It was about one incident, one airport, one person. Today, I'm proud to announce that our program has trained over 10,000 aviation security personnel nationwide. In the front row, James Morrison sat straight-backed in his new business suit, a small pin on his lapel showing Elite Aviation's logo. Next to him sat Jenny Martinez, now the head of training implementation, and Lisa Rodriguez, who had been promoted to National Security Operations Director. Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing remarkable statistics. Discrimination complaints have dropped by 75% at participating airports. Employee satisfaction has increased by 60%, but numbers don't tell the whole story. She gestured to the side of the stage, where a large screen flickered to life. The face of an elderly Middle Eastern man appeared, a renowned heart surgeon who frequently flew private jets to perform emergency surgeries. Before this program, the surgeon said in the video, I was stopped and questioned at every airport, despite my credentials. Now, I'm treated with respect. I can focus on saving lives instead of proving I belong. More testimonials followed. A black tech CEO, a Latino airline owner, an Indian film director. Each shared stories of how the aviation industry's changing culture had improved their travel experiences. Morrison took the stage next, his confidence now matching his position. Change isn't just about rules and procedures, he explained. It's about changing hearts and minds. Last month, I received this letter from a security officer in Miami. He read from the letter. I was about to stop a young Asian woman from entering our private terminal. She didn't fit my image of a private jet owner. Then I remembered your story, Mr. Morrison. I checked her credentials properly. Turns out she was a 28-year-old tech entrepreneur who had just sold her company for millions. Your mistake saved me from making the same one. Jenny stepped up to join them, bringing her own perspective. We've created support groups at every participating airport, she explained. Security officers can share experiences, discuss challenges, and learn from each other. We're building a community of change. The audience listened intently as they described new initiatives: a mentorship program for minority aviation professionals, a scholarship fund for diverse students entering aviation security, and a partnership with major airlines to extend the training to all airport staff. During the break, a reporter from Aviation Weekly approached Morrison. "Did you ever imagine your lowest moment would lead to such widespread change?" Morrison shook his head, smiling. "My lowest moment became my greatest opportunity, thanks to Ms. Chen Williams' vision. She saw potential for change where others might have only seen reason for punishment." Back on stage, Sarah shared their plans for international expansion. Airports in Europe, Asia, and Australia had requested the program. The map behind her zoomed out, showing potential sites across the globe. "But our proudest achievement," Sarah continued, "isn't the numbers or the awards. It's the stories we don't hear, confrontations that don't happen, the assumptions that aren't made, the people who are treated with dignity simply because it's right." She showed one final slide, a split screen. On one side was the security footage from that original morning, showing Morrison blocking her path. On the other side was a recent photo of Morrison training a group of international security directors. "This is what transformation looks like," Sarah declared. "This is what happens when we choose education over punishment, understanding over anger, growth over blame." After the presentation, as attendees crowded around to ask questions, Morrison's phone buzzed. It was a message from his daughter-in-law. "Dad, just flew through LAX. The security officer there told me about your program. She said you're her hero. You're mine too." Morrison looked up from his phone to see Sarah watching him with a knowing smile. They had both come so far from that morning a year ago, but somehow they both knew their journey was just beginning. Outside, the New York skyline glittered in the evening light as planes drew bright lines across the darkening sky, carrying passengers who would benefit from changes they might never know had started with one confrontation and one choice to make things right. 18 months after the incident that changed everything, the private terminal at LAX looked very different. New signs welcomed travelers in multiple languages, and the security desk displayed a clear code of conduct. Behind the desk sat Jenny Martinez, now supervising the morning shift, while James Morrison prepared for his most important presentation yet. The terminal's largest conference room was packed with unusual visitors today. High school students from across Los Angeles, all part of a new aviation career program that Morrison and Sarah Chen Williams had created together. 2 years ago, Morrison began, looking at the eager young faces. "I stood at the security desk out there and made the biggest mistake of my career. But today, I'm going to tell you how that mistake changed not just my life, but the entire aviation industry." The students leaned forward as Morrison shared his story. Among them sat his own granddaughter, Sophia, who had recently announced her dream of becoming a pilot. 2 years ago, he might have doubted whether she'd face fair treatment in the industry. Now, he felt hope. Sarah arrived halfway through Morrison's presentation, slipping quietly into the back of the room. She smiled, remembering how far they'd come. The training program they'd started had evolved into something much bigger: the Aviation Equality Initiative, now active in 15 countries. After the students left, Sarah called Morrison into her office. The view outside her window showed a diverse group of aviation professionals going about their day: pilots, executives, security personnel, all working together seamlessly. "Remember this?" Sarah asked, pulling out a frame containing the original security footage photo from their confrontation. Next to it sat a more recent photo: Morrison and Sarah receiving the National Aviation Leadership Award for Excellence in Industry Transformation. "Hard to believe that was the same person," Morrison replied, shaking his head at his old self in the security footage. "I have news," Sarah said, putting down the frames. "The International Aviation Authority has voted to make our training program mandatory for all international airports. They're calling it the Morrison-Chen Protocol." Morrison sat down, overwhelmed. "They're naming it after us." "After you," Sarah corrected. "My name's just there because I was lucky enough to be part of your transformation story." Just then, Lisa Rodriguez burst into the office, excitement on her face. "The final numbers are in," she announced. 100% of our security staff has completed the advanced training. Employee retention is up 80%, and we've had zero discrimination complaints for 6 straight months. Morrison smiled, remembering how impossible such numbers had seemed 18 months ago. What about the scholarship program? He asked. 25 students signed up today, Sarah replied, including your granddaughter, I noticed. She's quite impressive. She wants to be the first black female CEO of a major airline, Morrison said proudly. 2 years ago, I might have told her to set more realistic goals. Now I'm helping her plan her path to get there. The afternoon sun streamed through Sarah's office window as they reviewed more updates. The training program had sparked other changes: mentorship programs, career development initiatives, and even changes to security technology to help eliminate unconscious bias. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jenny entered, leading a tour group of international airport executives. And this, she announced, is where it all began. The office where Ms. Chen Williams chose to transform a moment of discrimination into a movement for change. The executives murmured appreciatively, taking photos. Morrison stood to leave, but Sarah stopped him. Stay, she said. They should hear the story from both of us. As they shared their journey once again, Morrison noticed something new in the executives' eyes. Not just professional interest, but genuine understanding. They weren't just hearing about change, they were seeing it in action. Later that evening, as the sun set over Lax, Morrison took one last walk through the terminal before heading home. He passed the spot where he had tried to turn Sarah away that fateful morning. Now, a plaque hung there reading, "Change begins with one moment of truth." As he drove home, the lights of planes taking off painted trails across the darkening sky, carrying people of all backgrounds to their destinations. Each flight represented a small victory. Outside, a young black female pilot walked confidently toward her plane, nodding hello to the security team. The security officer smiled, checked her credentials professionally, and wished her a good flight. No assumptions, no bias, no hesitation. Morrison watched the interaction with satisfaction. This was his real legacy, not the awards or the program named after him, but these small moments of dignity and respect happening thousands of times each day at airports around the world.